The neighbors called it an eyesore. They said it loud enough for him to hear, standing on their porches with their coffee mugs, watching the old man work in the cold. But the winter that froze the pipes and killed the power lines was the same winter that turned that eyesore into the only warm place left in Heron Falls, and every single one of them came knocking. Arthur Briggs had moved to Heron Falls, Ontario, 3 years after he retired from the Canadian Armed Forces. He was 64 years old, quieter than he used to be, and he drove a truck that had seen better decades. He picked Heron Falls because it was small enough that nobody would ask too many questions, and because the property at the end of Concession Road 7 had a woodlot and a creek and enough space between the house and the nearest neighbor that he could breathe without feeling like someone was measuring his exhale. He had a dog named Scout, a 6-year-old Belgian Malinois with one slightly torn ear and eyes that tracked movement the way radar tracks aircraft. Arthur had adopted him through a veterans placement program 2 years earlier, and in that time, Scout had become less a pet and more a fact of life. The way the sun coming through the east window every morning was a fact of life. The way the sound of the creek was a fact of life. You stopped noticing them only when they were gone. The town itself was the kind of place that had strong opinions about how things should look. The houses along Maple Street had matching shutters. The community hall had a fresh coat of paint every second spring. The Kowalski family had complained to the township when Ed Prentice left a rusted harrow on his front lawn for 6 weeks, and that was considered big news for most of February. So, when Arthur Briggs began building a structure that wrapped around 3 sides of his house in mid-October, the neighborhood had thoughts. It wasn't a garage. It wasn't exactly a barn. It was a covered framework, open on the sides but roofed, extending out from the walls of the house by about 12 feet in places, supported by posts he cut and set himself over the course of 2 weeks. He filled it gradually with firewood, cord after cord, stacked in a pattern that made no immediate sense to anyone watching from the road. The wood wasn't just piled. It was arranged, angled, layered, with gaps between rows and what appeared to be deliberate spacing near the walls of the house itself. What in the world is he building out there? Carol Renshaw asked her husband at dinner one evening. She could see Arthur's property from her kitchen window, and she'd taken to watching him the way you watch weather you don't understand. Phil Renshaw looked up from his plate. No idea. Asked him last week. He said it was a wood storage system. It's an eyesore, Carol said. It looks like he's building a barn around his house. That version of the story traveled fast. The old veteran is building a barn around his house. By the time it reached the other end of Concession Road, people were saying he'd lost his mind. Someone mentioned it at the township meeting, not formally, just in the parking lot after. Keith Arsenault, who owned the property adjacent to Arthur's, made a comment about property values that got a few laughs. Arthur was aware of all of it. Small towns weren't actually quiet. They were just quiet in the wrong directions. He heard what people were saying. He kept building. Scout worked alongside him in the way that only a well-trained working dog can, which is to say he was neither in the way nor unhelpfully far. He sat near whatever Arthur was doing, alert but calm, occasionally checking the woodlot perimeter for things that needed checking. On the colder mornings, he pressed close to Arthur's leg during breaks, and Arthur would rest one hand on the dog's side, without looking down, the way you rest your hand on a railing. Arthur's daughter Claire called every Sunday. She lived in Guelph with her husband and their 2 kids, and she worried about him in a specific way. Adult children worry about a parent who won't admit to being anything other than fine. Dad, I heard you're building something big. Where'd you hear that? Aunt Sandra saw something on the Heron Falls Facebook group. Arthur was quiet for a moment. It's a firewood shelter. People are saying it looks like you're wrapping the house in a shed. People are right. She didn't know what to say to that. Are you okay? I'm better than okay, he said. I've got 12 cords of hardwood and the best dog in the province. I'm doing fine. What Arthur hadn't told Claire, hadn't told anyone, was that the structure wasn't just about storage. He'd spent 2 decades in the military, including years in climates that had tried hard to kill him with cold. He understood something about thermal mass, about wind exposure, about how a building that seemed solid could bleed heat through its north wall at a rate that would quietly destroy you over a long winter. His house in Heron Falls was old. The insulation was inadequate. The furnace was reliable but not remarkable. And he'd read the long-range forecasts that November, the kind that climatologists publish in papers nobody reads, and what he'd read had made him go back to the woodlot with a chainsaw. He wasn't building an eyesore. He was building a buffer. The idea was simple in the way that things developed through hard experience are simple. The firewood structure would act as a windbreak on the north and west faces of the house, reduce heat loss through those walls by interrupting direct wind exposure, and provide enough thermal mass. Dry wood holds heat differently than open air, that the space between the structure and the house would stay measurably warmer than the ambient temperature outside. He'd calculated it on paper. He'd done the math more than once. And he'd been in enough situations where preparation was the difference between a bad outcome and a catastrophic one, that he didn't feel particularly bothered by what Carol Renshaw thought about it. Scout seemed to understand, in the way animals sometimes seem to understand things that logic says they shouldn't. He watched the structure take shape with an attention that felt less like curiosity and more like approval. By the 3rd week of November, the framework was finished. By the 1st week of December, most of the wood was in place. Arthur looked at it from the road one evening, hands in his pockets, breath fogging the cold air. Scout sat beside him. From the outside, it looked strange, no question. A house half swallowed by a wooden lean-to that ran east to west and wrapped around the north corner. The roofline of the structure was corrugated steel, simple, functional. The wood inside was stacked with precision, tight enough to be stable, spaced enough to breathe and dry. To the untrained eye, it looked like chaos. To Arthur, it looked like preparation. The 1st week of January was when everything changed. The storm came in from the northwest on a Tuesday night, which was the kind of detail that sounds irrelevant until you're living it. A pressure system that the weather services had tracked but underestimated made contact with the frozen air mass sitting over Georgian Bay and produced something that wasn't quite a blizzard and wasn't quite an ice storm, but managed to be worse than either. The temperature dropped to -31 with the wind chill. The ice came first, a thin glaze that coated every road, every power line, every tree branch in the township. Then the wind, then the snow, driving sideways. The power went out in Heron Falls at 11:42 on Tuesday night. It didn't come back. Wednesday morning, the hydro crews couldn't move their equipment because the roads were impassable. The main supply line into the township had 2 trees down across it, and both trees had ice on them that made the works slow and dangerous. The township emergency coordinator sent out notices. Stay home. Conserve heat. Help was coming, but it would take time. Most of the houses on Concession Road had electric baseboards or forced air furnaces with electric ignitions. Without power, they were cold boxes. Some people had fireplaces, decorative ones with gas inserts that also required electricity. Some had a cord or two of wood, the kind people buy for ambiance on winter weekends, not survival. One family had a generator, but it ran out of fuel by Thursday afternoon. Arthur's furnace ran on oil with a power-dependent ignition. When the power went out, he switched to the wood stoves he'd installed in the front room and the kitchen. He had 12 cords of hardwood within arm's reach of his house. He had a structure that was cutting the wind chill on his north and west walls by a measurable margin. His pipes didn't freeze. His house stayed at a temperature that was livable. Not luxurious, but livable. Scout slept on his blanket near the front room stove, with the relaxed posture of an animal that is warm and fed and entirely unconcerned. By Thursday morning, Arthur heard the knock at his door. It was Phil Renshaw. He looked like he hadn't slept. He was wearing 2 jackets. "My wife's hands are numb," he said. We've been running the gas stove with the oven open, but the house is 12 degrees. Arthur looked at him for a moment. Then he stepped aside. Come in. Carol Renshaw came in behind her husband, wrapped in a blanket she'd brought from home. She looked at Arthur's front room. The wood stove radiating steady heat, the kettle on the range, Scout lifting his head from his blanket to assess the newcomers, and her eyes filled. She didn't say anything about the structure outside. She didn't have to. By Thursday afternoon, Arthur had 4 families in his house. He put the Arsenal kids in the front room, closest to the stove. He gave the older couple from the end of the road, the Beckers, the bedroom with the south-facing window. He made soup on the wood stove, a large pot of it, whatever was in the root cellar and the pantry, turnips and potatoes, and a ham hock he'd been saving. He made tea. He kept the fires going, splitting wood in the covered structure where the wind couldn't touch him. Scout at his heels, both of them working through the cold with the steady efficiency of creatures who had trained for exactly this. Keith Arsenal was among those who came. He came on Thursday evening, alone, his wife and kids already inside. He stood in Arthur's kitchen and looked at the older man adding wood to the stove, and he said, quiet enough that the others wouldn't hear, I didn't understand what you were building. Arthur set a log in carefully. Most people don't. I said things I shouldn't have. Arthur looked at him. There was no anger in the look, which was somehow more significant than if there had been. I know, he said. It's all right. Keith nodded, slowly. He looked like a man who had been somewhere cold and wasn't sure yet how to be warm again. Can I help with the firewood? He asked. Yes, Arthur said. You can. The power came back on Saturday morning. The hydro crews had worked through the night, and when the lights flickered on across the township just after 7 a.m., people cried. Some of them were crying for the first time in years and didn't expect it, the way relief can ambush you. Arthur's house emptied slowly, families returning to their own rooms and their own heat, children who'd slept on couch cushions and air mattresses going back to their beds. People shook his hand. A few hugged him. Carol Renshaw stood in his front hallway with her coat on and said, I owe you an apology. And Arthur shook his head. You don't, he said. Go warm your house up. What happened next was not the kind of story that ends in a single moment. Keith Arsenault came back the following weekend, this time to ask Arthur about the construction. He brought a notepad. He brought his son, who was studying civil engineering at Waterloo, and who became very quiet and very attentive when Arthur started explaining the principles. Thermal mass, wind exposure, buffer spacing, snow load distribution across the roofline of the secondary structure. The son, whose name was Ben, asked questions for 2 hours. Scout slept near the stove and occasionally lifted his head when someone raised their voice for emphasis. At some point Ben said, This is actually elegant, in the specific tone of a young engineer encountering a solution that is simple in a way he respects. Arthur looked at him. It's not complicated, he said. It's just paying attention. By February, 3 other properties in the township had begun construction of similar structures. They weren't all as large as Arthur's. They weren't all as systematically planned. But they were there. Wooden frameworks, covered storage, an acknowledgement that preparation was worth more than appearances. Claire drove up from Guelph on the 3rd weekend of February. She pulled in at dusk, and she sat in her car for a moment, looking at her father's house, at the structure that wrapped around it like a set of arms, at the lamp in the front window, and the smoke from the chimney bending west in the wind. She found him in the kitchen, Scout pressed against his leg under the table. She sat down across from him, and he poured her a cup of tea without asking. The neighbors came, she said. It wasn't a question. She'd heard most of it from him by phone, but she wanted to hear it again here, in the house where it happened. They did, he said. And you took them all in. What was I going to do? He said, not take them in? She wrapped her hands around the mug. People weren't kind to you about the structure. No, he agreed. And you still? Claire, he said it the way fathers say a child's name when they want them to stop working something out and just be in the room. I wasn't building it to be kind or not kind. I built it because the winter was going to be bad and I wanted to be ready. What people thought about it while I was building it didn't change whether it would work. She looked at him for a long time. Outside, the wind moved through the covered structure, the way it does when it finds a space that has learned to receive it. Scout lifted his head briefly, then set it back down. Arthur finished his tea. He looked at his daughter, at the familiar face of someone he loved who had been worried about him for years, and would probably be worried about him for years more. And he felt something that wasn't pride exactly, more like steadiness. The feeling of a structure that has been tested and held. Stay for dinner, he said. She stayed for the weekend. The people of Heron Falls would talk about that January for a long time. They would talk about the ice storm and the power lines and the 3 days without heat. They would talk about the soup and the cots and the children who had slept on Arthur Briggs' floor. And they would talk about the structure, which had gone from being an eyesore to being a landmark. Something drivers on Concession Road pointed out to passengers who had never seen it. That's the Briggs place. You know about what happened there in January? Scout lived to be 12 years old. He spent his last years the way his best years had been spent. Close to Arthur, unhurried, alert without anxiety, watching things the way a good dog watches things when it knows the perimeter is safe. The structure stood for years after that. People stopped calling it an eyesore sometime around March of that first winter. By the following year, they had stopped calling it anything at all, which is the way things go when they become simply part of the landscape, when they stop being strange and become, instead, just what's there, just what held